Thank you, Penny. So, I'm going to be talking about the last 40 years and what UN Habitat envisioned and what has actually happened, and the lessons that we can draw from that experience. Between the 31st of May and the 11th of June in 1976, Vancouver hosted the first United Nations Conference on Human Settlements. A legacy of that conference, the Vancouver Declaration of Human Settlements, a 6-page document that is a stirring expression of hope in what was referred to at the time as the new international economic order. I would like to begin my talk with a few excerpts to give you a sense of this document as a whole. The first paragraph starts like this: "Mankind must not be daunted by the scale of the task ahead. There is need for awareness and responsibility, for increased activity of the national governments and international community, aimed at mobilization of economic resources, institutional changes, and international solidarity. By first, adopting bold, meaningful, and effective human settlement policies and spatial planning strategies, realistically adapted to local conditions. Second, creating more livable, attractive, and efficient settlements which recognize human scale, the heritage and culture of people, and the special needs of disadvantaged groups within a framework of social justice. Among the general principles to guide this enterprise, I will quote only the first 2 of the 19 principles. The first principle was the improvement of the quality of life of human beings is the first and most important objective of every human settlement policy, beginning with the satisfaction of the basic needs of food, shelter, clean water, employment, health, education, in a framework of freedom, dignity, and social justice. And second, in striving to achieve this objective, priority must be given to the needs of the most disadvantaged people. And finally, on pages 5 and 6, we come to the guidelines for action. And I quote again. First, it is recommended that governments and international organizations should make every effort to take urgent action as set out in the following guidelines. Second, it is the responsibility of governments to prepare spatial strategy plans and adopt human settlement policies to guide the socio-economic development efforts. Such policies must be an essential component of an overall development strategy, linking and harmonizing them with policies on industrialization, agriculture, social welfare, and environmental and cultural preservation so that each supports the other in a progressive improvement in well-being of mankind. And then I skip to number 8. Adequate shelter and services are a basic human right which places an obligation on governments to ensure their attainment for all the people, beginning with direct assistance to the least advantaged through guided programs of self-help and community action. And finally, 11th, the equal participation of women must be guaranteed. The tone of these excerpts, indeed of the entire document, is a deeply moral one. Appeal is made to the responsibility of governments and international organizations, and terms such as must, urgent, needs, and an emphasis on the most disadvantaged are found throughout this document. As a special point of interest for us here today, the document also advocates, quote, a comprehensive, coordinated strategy and planning effort. When the Vancouver Declaration was issued, I was already 7 years into my work at UCLA and had behind me 20 years as a development planner in Brazil, South Korea, Venezuela, Chile, Mozambique, and Japan. But rather than tell you my own story, I want to focus on some of the things I learned in the course of my practice as an overseas human settlement expert. At the time, no one knew that 1976 would be what in world historical terms I would call a hinge year that marks the end of one era and the beginning of another. In China, 1976 is the year Mao Zedong dies, bringing his devastating cultural revolution to an end. In the ensuing transition, Deng Xiaoping becomes China's supreme leader, ushering in a reform era that would lead to the country's rise as a global power. As US manufacturing begins to relocate to Asia and America is shifting to a post-industrial economy, export orientation becomes the new mantra of economic wisdom, replacing more endogenous efforts at national development. State-centric Keynesian economic policies are abandoned and replaced by the neoliberal policy of Thatcher and Reagan. While the Vancouver Declaration is still at pains to declare national states to be sovereign and supreme, indeed, as governments with a capital G, what happens on the ground is a gradual hollowing out of the state in the Western world and the emergence of a borderless global network of some 20 or 30 so-called world cities or global cities as the hubs of a new capitalist order. In this emerging global economy, the rest of the world is pushed to the margins of attention. And instead of international cooperation to address the ever-urgent needs of human settlements, neoliberal gurus encourage fierce intercity competition to attract footloose capital. Cities are to brand and market themselves much as corporations do. In the new development game, there would be winners and losers. In political terms, the world is characterized today less by order than disorder. World War II had ended in 1945, and 4 years later, China's civil war had brought the Communist Party to power. But war of one sort or another would become a permanent feature of the world we live in. Many, though admittedly not all, are imperial wars of the global hegemon, the United States. 2 of them precede the hinge year of 1976, Korea and the terrible prolonged conflict in Vietnam. Afghanistan comes next. The war began as a sort of police action against the revolutionary Islamic movement of Al-Qaeda, which had found a safe haven in Afghanistan under the Taliban regime, is continuing as I write. Next comes Iraq, launched by the US in collaboration with Great Britain, Canada, and other allied forces in 2003. That's 12 years ago. It too is intended as a sort of police action to remove the regime of Saddam Hussein. Initially successful, the war has dragged on for 12 years and is continuing. Meanwhile, America is trying to unseat the existing Syrian regime in Damascus. This intervention, which now has also drawn Russia, Iran, and Saudi Arabia into the conflict, continues unabated. Another Middle Eastern conflict, the self-styled ISIS, has swept through parts of Syria and Iraq in the currently ongoing struggle for the soul of Islam, a struggle that ranges from Nigeria in West Africa through North Africa and the Middle East to the furthest reaches of the Muslim world in Asia. Its ultimate outcome is by no means assured. To complete the picture, the so-called and largely secret war on terror is being waged by the US as a form of low-level warfare by drones, guided missiles, and special operations forces on a worldwide basis. It is a war without a foreseeable end. I have dwelt on war because war is the great destroyer of cities. War doesn't build cities, it kills people, displaces more than 60 million people who flee from battle zones to near and far countries to save bare life. War is a destroyer of life. It acts like those tectonic shifts of the Earth's crust that result in catastrophic earthquakes and tsunamis. But let me return to my initial question. What have we learned in 40 years of development work that might enable us, planners, designers, engineers, to deal effectively with the urban challenge of the next 40 years? Today's world is no longer the still hopeful world of '76. The times have become more violent and unpredictable as we confront the unprecedented challenges of global climate change. The ice cap of Greenland is disappearing as streams of melting glaciers erode its ancient surface. Sea levels are rising faster than predicted. Fossil fuels are rapidly depleting, forcing us to explore and capture new sources of energy. Water supplies, so essential for life, are vanishing. Rivers and lakes are drying up. Ancient aquifers are close to exhausted. And in rapidly urbanizing Asia, cities are coalescing into gigantic pluricentric regions, some housing over 100 million residents in dense urban clusters whose environmental impacts stagger the imagination. This is the global context within which we have to practice our professions. Development planning is a form of technical reason subordinate to political reason. Although part of the structure of governance, the city-building professions are by no means the leading part. It is politicians who tell planners what to do. One difficulty resulting from this dependent relationship is that politicians' time horizon tends to be short, as their tenure in office is typically brief, whereas planners tend to be visionaries and have a professional stake in long-term outcomes. Meticulously prepared and often exquisitely drawn, their long-term visions pose no immediate threat for politicians. It may even create the illusion that the politicians who approve them are practical visionaries, while actual decisions on the ground are based on criteria of short-run political advantage. Moreover, when plans have statutory force, the process of plan preparation and approval by senior government may take years, leaving a city to be built as it will. A good example of this situation are the planning museums which can be found in major cities throughout China. The centerpiece of these museums is a huge three-dimensional model of the future city that occupies a vast domed space on the second or third floor, surrounded by a visitor's gallery. Unsurprisingly, this gallery is always crowded, with people trying to locate their own neighborhood to find out if it's still standing in the model down below, and if it is, can then be lit up by pressing a button as soothing music plays in the background. As advertisements of things to come, these model cities are hard to beat. The museum also includes visuals of recent, current, and projected projects, all of which are of interest and tend to have a more realistic claim on the future than the centerpiece under the dome. Another difficulty with plan making is that planners lack the requisite powers to implement anything at all. The statutory nature of plans is to correct for this, as the existing plan is meant to guide the city planning building process. But the timing is out of phase, and implementing agencies can ignore comprehensive plans with impunity. If one line of tension is with politicians, another is with the implementing functional agencies that tend to monopolize functional domains, such as transportation, housing, parks, and so on, that can reach all the way down to local land use and infrastructure decisions. In some countries, such as Chile or Japan, both of which are unitary states, it is often national ministries and their internal planning specialists that have the decisive voice and whose views of particular cities tend to be distant and vague. Their understanding of the local depends for the most part on out-of-date maps and other forms of representations rather than on close personal touch and experience with local realities. The ministerial decisions should somehow be coordinated by local planning organs is at any rate a risible proposition. A third problem confronting planners is that their long-term visions are fiscally unconstrained. Cost calculus does not enter visionary plan making, a serious handicap when urban budgets are tight and uncertain, which is the normal state of affairs. Finally, as usually conceived, the long-range perspective of planning is that unforeseen events, which is mostly what happens in rapidly growing cities, play roulette with city futures. There are regime changes that inevitably demand new visions and priorities. There are windfall opportunities that must be seized. There are emergencies due to war, fire, floods, and earthquakes that upset long-term visions and require a major reshuffling of resources. And on top of these, there are national and global changes such as inflationary pressures, periodic but frequently long-lasting economic recessions, changes in the exchange rate and the price of oil, new international determinations, all of which can explode local visions. It is small wonder, then, that many cities choose to outsource plan preparations, which are thus reduced to a ritual performance to propitiate the goodwill of senior governments that must approve them. Another major concern is the quality of life in the lived spaces of the city. The term quality of life is variously understood and rarely measured with any convincing metric. It is nonetheless a central objective of planning. Quality of life indicators have occasionally been tried, but to make sense of them, they would need to be aggregated to reflect differences across a given territory and indicate what needs to be done to reduce major spatial inequalities. This is particularly a problem where a large part of the housing is unregulated or informal, and where even the most basic services are lacking, water and sanitation above all, but also community centers, laundry facilities, kindergartens, schools, medical clinics, and the like, whose presence in local neighborhoods would markedly improve the quality of life of local residents. Instead of assisting in their piecemeal provision, the answer of government has been more often simply to declare the neighborhood a threat to health and civility, eradicate it, move the resident population to some distant, less visible part of the city, and redevelop the sites thus gained with profitable upscale housing and commercial redevelopments. One lesson to be learned from this is that the quality of life, however we define it, is above all experienced by people in the places they inhabit. It is thus the local quality of life that matters. And to discover this, planners would need to go down into the small spaces of the city, the neighborhoods and wards, and engage the local community to discover specific needs and priorities. So understood, planning for the quality of life would thus become a more interactive process involving local citizens. Solutions, on the other hand, often require a more capacious view because many qualitative aspects of life are system-wide rather than local. Thus, for example, the journey to work and the financial and physical effort needed to ameliorate lengthy and expensive commutes. Health facilities and schools, as well as water and sewers, are all systemic services. And once we acknowledge that, it takes us straight back to the politics of planning, because upper-class suburbs are able to attract such services while neighboring poor-quality settlements lack the necessary clout to reverse priorities in the provision of infrastructure. The well-known Brazilian participatory budgetary process, which was designed in the early 90s to accomplish precisely such outcomes, lasted only for as long as the radical wing of the Workers' Party dominated Porto Alegre's politics. Although the idea of participatory budgets eventually traveled to other cities in Brazil and even abroad, it rarely succeeded in duplicating the progressive outcomes in the city of origin. You may think that this view of planning and other city-building professions is too dark and one-sided. What about positive accomplishments of planning? Let me tell you a story. In the early 1960s, I was part of a team that was put together by the Joint Center for Urban Studies at MIT and Harvard to work collaboratively with the Corporación Venezolana de Guayana in planning the development of the Guayana region in the eastern part of the country, or more precisely, to design a new industrial city at the confluence of the Caroni and Orinoco rivers. The government had decided to build a major hydroelectric dam at that site, and new industries, a steel mill, aluminum plant, pulp and paper, and cement would require a city attractive to both workers and managerial staff. Over the 5 years of this collaborative effort, from 1961 to 66, so a decade before the hinge year of 1976, the Joint Center had recruited a truly stellar cast of professionals whose critical reflections on the project were published a few years later in a volume edited by Lloyd Rawin of MIT, who headed this project on the American side. One of the key participants was Lisi Pitti, a social anthropologist who subsequently joined the planning faculty at MIT. She had been the center's observer on the site itself, whose experiences and critical views were first published in 1967 as The View from the Barrio. 20 years later, she returned to take another look at the city where she had lived and worked for over a year. It is from her second book on Ciudad Guayana that I would like to take brief excerpts to illustrate what happens to a planning project that engaged some of the best talents in Venezuela and the US. The book is entitled Planning, Rethinking Ciudad Guayana, and published in 1987. I should add that today, 55 years after it has begun, the city is standing. It has a population of about 850,000 that is larger than Vancouver's. But, as we shall see, it is a rather different place from what its planners had intended. Here are some of Peters' observations, and I quote, "But what kind of a city is it?" she asks. The planners had concerned themselves with issues of economic efficiency, amenity, social equity, and community. The city, as it has evolved, is conspicuously lacking in all four counts. It lacks efficiency. 3/4 of the population live at one end of a lineal city, and the major industries and 2/3 of the jobs are located at the other end. Thus, the majority of the population must commute daily the length of the city. They must make the commute across a classic bottleneck, a double bridge over the river that separates the two sections. The distribution of population is not at all that which had been planned. Although specific predictions varied, all the planners proposed that, quote, in the long run, residential growth would move westward from Puerto Ordaz in a broad band from the steel mill, leaving only a minority of the population in San Felix. The situation is at present reversed. Since nearly 3/4 of the population live to the east in San Felix, both halves of the city lack amenity. The eastern part of the city, in which the working class lives, consists of a series of shantytown settlements. Streets are cheaply paved, if at all, and lack adequate drainage. In 1983, a study found that only 1/3 of households in this sector were connected to the city's water system. The city lacks equity. Per capita Development Agency in 1977, the Development Agency in 1977 had invested in the privileged Puerto Ordaz part 39 times what it had invested in the working class part, and it is apparent to any casual glance. The city lacks community. A 1983 report from the Urban Development Agency points to the numerous factors which create a strong social segregation within the urban area. It is not only that there is no single center that serves as a point of identification for all citizens, or more accurately in this case, the inhabitants. More striking is the fact that after 20 years, no one but the planners themselves still think of it as a single city. And that's the end of Lise Petey's assessment. Petey has her own explanation of why the existing city did not turn out as planned. While I do not dispute her interpretation, my understanding is different. Today's Ciudad Guayana is like any other Venezuelan city, socially divided, and certainly no better and possibly no worse, despite having been planned. I have tried in these remarks to identify some of the reasons for this: the uncertainties, the global forces, the politics, the regime changes, and the lack of implementing planning powers. Thus, I would argue that Ciudad Guayana emerged as a result of historical forces that coalesced to produce this characteristically Venezuelan dysfunctional urban settlement. I have tried in these comments to show some of the ways planning and, more broadly, the city-building professions have changed over the past 40 years. The Vancouver Declaration was signed at the cusp of a new era, an era that in 1976 none of us clearly envisioned. Now that a third Habitat Conference is about to be convened in Quito, in Ecuador, what can be said about what we have learned about our city building and its practices? Of necessity, I will be brief. First, we must learn how to live in a turbulent world in which there are no certainties, and where disasters of all sorts are more the rule than the exceptions. The current refugee crisis is an example. Several million people are reported to have been displaced from Syria within the last few years, seeking refuge primarily in neighboring countries such as Lebanon and Turkey. But at least 1 million have moved on to Europe and beyond. Even Canada is starting to receive its share. Planning to integrate these vast numbers of displaced persons in the cities of arrival poses a series of social, economic, and cultural challenges that involve all levels of government. Nor is the Syrian crisis likely to be a one-off event. With further global warming, for instance, large numbers of people are expected to flee from drowning cities to safe havens elsewhere. Short-term crisis management will no longer be exceptional. It may well become the normal state of affairs. Second, the Occupy Wall Street movement has highlighted the growing inequalities generated by neoliberal policies, which have downplayed the role of the state in its regulatory capacity, not only in the high-income countries of the West, but throughout the developing world. Growing and persisting disparities in life chances are likely to generate social unrest globally, so that planning for social justice will continue to be high on our agenda, a continuing challenge both politically and professionally. Third, planning has become much more than a profession concerned chiefly with regulating urban land use and mobility. Like engineering, we have become an umbrella profession that addresses all sorts of urban problematics: socio-cultural, environmental, physical, and economic. Recent challenges have planning for food security. Recent challenges have been planning for food security, planning with indigenous communities, disaster management and resilience, infrastructure planning, and conflict management, among others. Other priority areas for planning are likely to arise over the next several decades, adding to our concerns. I see this diversification of planning as a central challenge for professional education. How to accommodate these new demands for specialization that are no longer confined to local communities, but approach urban systems at all the relevant scales. Fourth, the neoliberal present has created a space for the increased role of organized civil society, as voluntary organizations, active chiefly at the local level, have taken on different social problems. But these organizations are often underfunded, and though politically active, they are fragmentary in approach. Collaborations within the civil society sector are rare, and in their advocacy mode, nothing like the well-heeled efforts of the private corporate sector. And yet, if we look for innovative approaches to planning, it is precisely in this disarticulated civil society that we find examples of struggles to address the many social and environmental problems of our era through collective efforts. I've therefore referred to organized civil society as the locus of radical planning. Fifth, planning and implementation need to be brought to get closer together. This is another way of saying that action should become the starting point for an effective planning rather than a vaguely defined afterthought pushed far out into the future. Plan making may serve various purposes of the political establishment of cities, but really effective planning is done, at least within government, by different functional sectors where it is closely articulated with annual budgets. Given the high rates of urbanization in transition societies, it makes little sense to engage in long-term visionary planning, since many of these plans are likely to come to grief. Effective planning is concerned with projects in the extended present. It is political commitments that are the starting point for bringing them to completion. It is the extended present, too, that local experiments can be launched, which probe for best approaches to resolve particular problems in planning. And it is also within this time frame that planners are likely to find the well-known collaborative and communicative strategies as the best means for bringing about real change. Sixth and last, in key regions of Asia, where the urban transition is still incomplete, an unprecedented form of urban is occurring that is characterized by very high population densities and unprecedented physical and demographic scales. These super cities, of which the Yangtze Delta conurbation focused on Shanghai is one, consist of multiple central cities, which together with their peri-urban areas comprise from 50 to over 100 million inhabitants at average densities of 1,000 plus per square kilometer. Similar conurbations are emerging in several regions within China, Vietnam, Indonesia, and India. Linked by high-speed trains and cyberspace, they function in at least some respects as single urban units. Under constant pressure to expand still further, they pose unprecedented challenges of governance that are as yet little understood. But as largely self-organizing urban systems, they also generate negative externalities on a scale consistent with their size that need to be reversed to prevent their eventual decline into chaos. I regard these super cities as the next great challenge for urban and more specifically planning research. These then are some of the things we have learned over the past 2 generations of world urbanization. They are suggestive of what we can expect in the future. The effective planning models of today are very different from those of harmony and order, comprehensiveness and rationality that still informed the generation of the 70s. Hopefully, they will serve us better than what in too many places around the world continues to be the sanctioned form of planning and city building practice. Thank you.